I recall, I really don't know clouds.
Great to see your face, Chip Conley.
Oh, thank you, Paula. How'd you unmute yourself? I love that.
I don't usually, but I saw there were only 11 of us here.
Oh, there's
And
there's
so,
140 of you now. So
yeah,
thank you, Paula.
If you
We're gonna
feel the
get started.
same that you
But we
feel,
got some Joni Mitchell here.
as every fairy tale comes true. I've looked at love that way.
Okay. Thank you, Connor. I just wish that all the politicians in the United States could listen to both sides now as a way to figure out how to make some sense of this world. Okay. I'm not going to talk too political today because why talk politics when you can talk peace and prosperity and love and solitude and most importantly, just personal transformation in a way that influences others. I am honored to be here. Kari was supposed to be here. She's sick and so is not able to join. It's appropriate that I'm here because Pico and I taught a workshop last summer. We're teaching a workshop this August about resilience, finding your center, and how to find resilience in the midst of a storm, which is sort of where we are on many levels as a society right now. Let me formally introduce Pico, who I just love. He's a celebrated author, one of the most trusted voices on finding peace in our chaotic modern world. For over 4 decades, Pico has explored the art of staying grounded while living fully, from his conversations with the Dalai Lama to his travels across more than 80 countries. He is one of my favorite travel writers, even though no one would really consider him a travel writer anymore, but that's one of his many skills. His New York Times bestselling book, The Art of Stillness, has become a modern classic, and his TED Talks have reached millions of people seeking balance in turbulent times. I did a little chat GBT, and guess what? Pico, you probably don't know it, but there is nobody on earth who has given more TED Talks. It's either 5 or 6. You'll tell me, in the last dozen years. Nobody, any else, nobody, other than Chris Anderson, who runs TED and he doesn't do talks. He just hosts. You've given more TED Talks, including this year. Although is that one out yet?
It's not out yet, no.
Not out yet. Okay. He's a longtime contributor to Time, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. Pico brings us wisdom that bridges ancient spiritual traditions with the very real pressures of contemporary life. Please join me in welcoming from Kyoto, Japan, very early in the morning, Pico Iyer.
Chip, I'm just so really happy to see you. Of course, I'm missing Carrie. I hope she gets better soon, but what a delight to see you. And you may not have known that I'm just completing a book now that is a lot about Joni Mitchell and about that song. And in the context of the MEA, it's so interesting that at the age of 21, she realized she'd seen life and love from both sides. And although when we hear her singing that in her late 70s or 80s, it has a power that's even deeper than when she recorded in the 60s. But as you say, Joni Mitchell is the voice of wisdom and beauty.
Wow, you and I are psychically connected. I deeply appreciate that. So for any of you who are going to come to join us in August, just know that there's going to be a lot of good vibe in the air. And your wife is going to join us too.
Yes, yes,
Roko.
yes,
Yes.
yes. She will never forget. After you spent four days and 5 days with us, and you gave the best summation of her and her character she's ever had. So she's really looking forward to chapter 2 in August.
Oh my gosh, it's a high standard to live up to. So Pico, you've spent decades learning from some of the world's most profound spiritual teachers, including the Dalai Lama. Can you share an insight from those conversations that might surprise people about what it
Hmm.
takes to find inner peace, especially during these times?
Oh, I love that question. Surprise. I mean, yeah, as you know, I've been lucky enough. I travel with the Dalai Lama 8 hours a day, day after day, year after year, and we've been talking for more than 50 years now. But I think in terms of surprise, every day when I'm with him, every hour, people come up to him with really heartfelt questions, and they say, "Your Holiness, what do you want? What do you do if you want to get rid of nuclear weapons and it hasn't happened, or you want to bring peace to the Middle East and it doesn't transpire, or you want to bring harmony to your community and it doesn't work out?" And he always looks at them with great kindness and sympathy. And he says, wrong dream. And so, from his point of view, it's really important to be realistic and rigorous and clear about our dreams and not to pitch them too high. And I think, my way of understanding that sometimes is to think if your dream is to marry Brad Pitt, it ain't going to happen.
Well,
But
he's having a midlife crisis based upon his recent wardrobe, but that's a different story.
yeah, maybe it will happen. But on the other hand, if you dream of finding qualities in your partner that Brad Pitt would envy, that could happen at any moment and will happen this afternoon. And I think, what people forget sometimes about the Dalai Lama is that he's been leader of his people for 86 years now. So he's doesn't have any interest in impractical strategies or romantic gestures. He just wants to know what's going to work. And I think one of the things that I've really gained from him is just this notion that you change the world by changing the way you look at the world. And instinctively, for example, the minute that he lost his homeland in Tibet 66 years ago, instead of seeing it as a loss, he realized it was an opportunity to bring his wisdom out into the larger world, to learn from the larger world, to reconstruct his community in every corner of the world, including the United States. And it's interesting, when I travel with him, he'll often say, I lost my home, and in the process, I gained the whole world as my
Hmm.
home.
Hmm.
And of course, that's a really nice line, and it's an easy line to say. But what's so touching is, I've been with him in Okinawa and Zurich and Jaipur and LA, and he lives it. I can just see he's entirely at home wherever he happens to be. I found out when I was writing a book on him that at the age of 24, he was sitting at home in Lhasa, Tibet, and he suddenly heard he had to leave forever that afternoon, or else there would be civil war and many lives would be lost. So he disguised himself. He fled over the highest mountains on earth with his family members and some bodyguards for 14 days. And he finally arrived in India in safety in 1959. And when he arrived in India, he turned to his little brother and he said, now we are free. And I think he meant not just that they were free from the threat, but now they were free to do all kinds of things. So the minute he'd lost his home, he was thinking, how can I make a new and better home? And how can I enjoy all these new opportunities I wouldn't have had before? And I'm often struck, we in the West talk a lot about bad karma and good karma. Something terrible happens to us. Oh, that's bad karma. And we sort of think of this as an emotional or spiritual bank account. We do a good deed and we accumulate good karma. We do a bad deed and we're getting bad karma. But when I ask the Dalai Lama about karma, for him, it's always in the future tense. He doesn't care about what happened already because you can't change that. All his emphasis is what you can do in the future. So his definition of karma is the good acts that we can do this tomorrow or in the next hour that are going to make everybody's life a lot better. And I remember during the pandemic, this really came home to me because I think every day I thought, well, I have a choice. Either I can think about all the things I'm missing and all the things I can't do, and there was a lot of that, or I can actually think of all the things I'm gaining and all the things that have been made possible by this. I get to be with my wife and my mother every day. I get to be free of jet lag. I get to be more focused. I get to remember the things I really care about. I think for all the grief and sorrow of the pandemic, many of us found that it opened doors that might have been closed otherwise. And I think so. The Dalai Lama is a great reminder of the fact that every door closing is really a few more doors opening.
Mm. Well, tell us, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, so that's why I'm asking, what happens when he passes in terms of how is the next Dalai Lama determined?
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. As you probably know, traditionally, there's a long series of rituals, and monks scatter across Tibet, and they see visions in a lake, and then they seek out a 2-year-old boy and put him through a series of tests, and none of that's going to be possible. So my guess is that he's going to designate somebody
Mm.
and tell the Tibetans, this is your new spiritual leader. And that person may not even wear the name of the Dalai Lama anymore. He often says the Dalai Lama institution worked when we were all in Tibet, but now we're scattered across the globe. Perhaps we don't need it anymore. He's often said that when he turns 90, which is actually 3 weeks from now, he's going to tell everybody what his plans are. But we'll wait and see. He hasn't said anything so far. But, he's so practical. He realizes that new circumstances need new solutions. And so now that he is outside Tibet, it'll have to take another form. And what he also knows is as soon as he dies, the government in Beijing will find a little boy who's a Communist Party member and say, this is the 15th Dalai Lama. So he has to preempt that, maybe by saying there'll be no future Dalai Lama.
It's interesting. Thich Nhat Hanh, before he passed, said that the next Buddha will be the Sangha. It'll be the community. So, maybe we are starting to evolve into a different perspective when it comes to spiritual leaders. Let me ask you another question. We live in a world that seems designed to scatter our attention with all the notifications, deadlines, endless stream of information coming at us every day. You've written so eloquently about the art of stillness. And that, by the way, you guys, is an exquisite book. Let's make sure we put it in the chat so that people can order it. I'm curious about those moments when we feel most fragmented. What would you offer someone who's sitting here today feeling like their mind is racing and they can't find their way back to themselves?
Hmm. Yeah, this is one reason I'm really looking forward to seeing you in August. This is exactly the question I want to ask you, because you have one of the busiest lives of anyone I know, and you always seem very calm and sunny. And of course, I'm no expert on this, but I think I can think of a few things. The first is take a walk, but imagine that you're trying to present your neighborhood as attractively as possible to a friend. In other words, get out of your head where things can seem really clamorous and deafening and get out into the world. Look around you rather than looking inside you. And that's instantly going to bring things in balance. If you're feeling really dizzy and there's too much going on in your head, turn off the lights and put on some music. I mean, the Joni Mitchell would be a good start.
Mm.
And I think instantly something in you is going to come to rest and be soothed. Another thing that I practice, I think a lot of people around the MEA and who are here today probably have a meditation practice or practice yoga. But for anyone who finds that a little daunting, I think if you just sit for 20 minutes, one corner of your room every morning without your devices, just to clear your head, set a tone for the day to come, just to step out of the crowded rush hour traffic that is our head and into the vast open meadow that is probably somewhere inside ourselves. I think nothing is lost if you do that, and so much is gained. And of course, it's not going to be an instantaneous gain. I mean, when many times my head is spinning with much too much, and there's no instant cure for that. But I think if I can implement some of these practices day after day after day, slowly I can see my head opening up and things calming down. I mean, you told me that by 8:30 this morning you'd already done 16,000 steps and you'd climbed up a mountain. I mean, what better way to clear your head and to be reminded, I mean, what you were just saying about Thich Nhat Hanh, out of your little self and into the wider world or into a bigger community. You were saying in your introduction how, as you know, I've been making my living in the mainstream media for 43 years, writing for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, all the usual suspects. And I think one of the main things I've learned from that is that there's only 5 minutes of news every day. And the other 23 hours and 55 minutes are opinion and argument and speculation and prediction. And so I think one of the best tools for me is to spend never more than 5 minutes a day on the news, but maybe less than 2 minutes.
Mm.
And to spend much more.
Jane, are you hearing that? I just want to make sure Jane is capturing that. I love you, Jane.
And again, it really came home to me during the pandemic because every day when I woke up, if I turned to the news, I would find that maybe 1,000 people had just died of COVID in Iran, or the mortuaries in Bolivia were overflowing. It's really tragic material, but I genuinely felt I couldn't do anything to help those people, and it really made me feel hopeless and powerless. And then I would look out my window in a radiant spring morning and be flooded with hope and a sense of possibility, and all the ways I could be a better friend or neighbor or husband or son, all the ways I could help the people immediately around me. And again, it made me think we have a choice every moment and every day. Are we going to attend to what opens us up or to what cuts us up? And I think everything will be determined by that. William James, who was so wise about human psychology, said, we are defined by what we choose to attend to. And I think
Mm.
the word I love in that is choose. You and I, in the next 12 hours, can choose where we turn our attention, and how everybody else is going to respond to us and how much we have to give to them is being determined by that. And I think, in terms of your basic question, what I find is if I try to keep up with the moment, I get dizzy, I get overwhelmed, because humans were just not meant to live at a pace determined by machines. And the only way we could do that is by becoming machines ourselves. But the world is speeding up so fast. I think if you try to keep up with it, you just end up frazzled. So step back and slow down. And I think the more we can just get ourselves back to a human pace, the more our minds clear out, and we can just feel calmer and more in tune with the world around us. It's almost, I think there's a great virtue in making a not to-do list. um, and also to do, doing nothing. And sometimes it's only by doing nothing we can do anything at all. In other words, it's only just by sitting still, taking a deep breath, not feeling we have to race around
Yeah.
that. And that can take many forms. I mean, as you say, I'm sure you have a very busy day today, but in preparation, 16,000 steps and climbing up a mountain is probably much better than sitting in front of your screen and
No
trying
doubt.
to do all the things. Yeah.
In terms of just noticing things, Richard Rohr, who taught last summer at MEA and is actually an MEA grad. He actually flew down to Baja 4 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, to actually basically be a student in a workshop. He says that as he's gotten older, and he's in his 80s now, he has found that gazing at things, just gazing, is so valuable to him, because in the process of just sort of looking at the expanse, he feels that sense of awe and beauty. And he becomes a first-class noticer. He's able to notice more what's going on inside himself when he can calm himself within the landscape, which is again one of the reasons why it's nice to get to be in places where you can have some solitude to do that. Let's move on to a question. You've been to 80 countries. Oh my God. And all kinds of cultures. Is there a key learning you have or a wisdom you have around how different cultures deal with stress and find peace? I mean, is there something we in the West, specifically the United States, are missing that other cultures have figured out?
Um, oh, I have something to say to that, but just before I do, I love Richard Rohr is a huge hero of mine, and one of the reasons I was so excited to be part of the MEA. And as a monk, he will know, to go back to what we were saying before, that monks talk about the process of being on retreat or whatever as recollection. And I love that, or the process of observing or just looking at the world around you. And I love that because the recollection means you're not trying to discover something or find some new revelation. You're remembering something you knew. Deep down, all of us know these things. We know the answers to the questions that you're asking, but we forget them or we get distracted or we lose them along the way. And it's just a matter of opening ourselves up enough to remember what deep down we knew.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say, which is, Kari and I came up with the title for this, Finding Your Center. But to speak to what you were just saying, I might have come up with a better title if I'd said Finding the Center. Because I think sometimes a lot of the ways of feeling better and calmer is getting out of your center and into that much larger center that you were describing with Richard Rohr and Thich Nhat Hanh. In terms of the cultures that maybe know how to deal better with stress. I think the whole point of the MEA often is that young people and young cultures have incredible enthusiasm, energy, hope that really invigorates us all. But older people and older cultures, as you and I were discussing when we co-led the workshop last year, and less surprised by reality. They've seen much more, we've been through much more, and often are much calmer because we've survived so many things already, and we're not so rattled by each new occurrence or change that comes to us. And so I think for that reason, when I moved from Midtown Manhattan to New York, I moved from Midtown Manhattan in New York to Japan. The reason I came to Japan was I think of it as a wise elder. And I think like a lot of older cultures, it's been through 1500 years of wars and plague and tumultuous politics and tsunamis. And so it's not surprised by reality. And it knows that any argument with reality is an argument you're never going to win, that you have to work with reality rather than pushing against it. And so I think in that way, it's much better able to deal with the many surprises life is sure to bring to us. And again, during the pandemic, I was going back and forth every few weeks, actually, between California and Japan. And as you know, Japan, they were taking and are still taking huge precautions. Even now, 50% of the people around me are masked. But at the same time, even though everyone in Japan was rattled and anxious during COVID-19, all the kids went to school, all the parents went to work. There was no chatter about it. And I think nobody was taken aback that life wasn't going according to our plans. And I think sometimes I think of that as the difference between, our culture in the US is based on the pursuit of happiness. And happiness doesn't always come when it's pursued, and happiness isn't the only fact of life, alas. Whereas here in a Buddhist country like Japan, the foundation is almost the reality of suffering, just a sense life's always going to be hard. But the difficulty of life isn't incompatible with wonder and beauty and hope. And that actually our job in life is to remain joyful in the midst of a world of sorrows, as they say in Japan. In other words, circumstances are always going to be hard, but we aren't going to be necessarily defeated by them. So I think just that difference of expectation, really, between, I think I remember a lot of my friends in California really outraged. Oh, I was going to take these 3 trips this year and now I can't. What's going on? Whereas I think in Japan, they know that we're always at the mercy of forces much greater than we are. And it's a joy when things work out, but it's not a surprise when they don't. And so I think in that regard, maybe the older cultures in the world have an advantage when it comes to dealing with stress. Probably the younger cultures in the world have a great advantage when it comes, to innovation and coming up with new ideas. And that's why my Japanese wife and so many of my Japanese friends love to be in the United States, because the US has many things that Japan might envy. But dealing with stress, probably the older cultures are better off.
I love the onsens. I love the bathhouses. I love the culture of bathing together and having that experience. And by the way, we have an annual MEA Film Festival, and we're dedicating one day of the film festival. There'll be 2 choices because there's 2 different venues on the ranch for the films. We're having a day full of Japanese films. Do you have any favorite Japanese films that you love?
The recent one was directed by a German, actually, but I don't know if you saw Perfect Days. But
Oh, with Wim Wenders. Yes.
yes,
Listen, you and I are psychically connected. We're actually playing it in the festival.
yeah.
Oh
The
my gosh.
deepest, most moving film. And as you know, it's just about the day in the life of a guy cleaning toilets, but everything is in that film for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. Oh my gosh. Well, so you talk about the Pilgrim's Way, this idea of approaching life's challenges with a different mindset. Can you help us understand what it means to meet our difficulties, not as victims of the circumstances, but as pilgrims on a journey? What does that mean? What shifts would we have to make in order to think of ourselves as pilgrims?
Hmm. I suppose, to answer the first part of that question, I don't think we're victims of circumstance, and I don't think we're masters of circumstance. But I do think our lives are determined not by what happens to us, but by what we do with what happens to us. And again, you know more about this than I. You've been through a lot of disruptions, and you've seen how your life is going to be determined by how you respond to those disruptions. The disruptions are non-negotiable, but what we do with them is up to us. I remember when I was a kid, I read that line in Hamlet, there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And I think there's a real truth to that. Whatever we're going through, what we're going through is really defined by the choices that we make. I think the pilgrim's mind, in some ways, the pilgrim is traveling not to conquer the world, but to surrender to the world.
Hmm.
A pilgrim is traveling to be silenced, to be taken out of himself. And again, I loved what you were saying about the onsen, and that's part of the answer to the previous question. I think part of what makes Japan so resilient as a culture and many other places is this sense of community. And if you're part of a big community, and if you're a drop in the ocean, you know that many things can happen to that drop, but the ocean remains itself. That if you're part of a bigger whole, people and destinies come and go, but that big whole is strong and lasts longer than you will. And the more you're part of a community, the stronger you will be inside yourself, as you know, creating the MEA. And so I think a pilgrim, among other things, is stepping into community. It's almost like you're leaving yourself back home and you're joining something much larger than yourself in time and space. People who walk the Camino, part of the beauty of it, I gather, is that you're with lots of other people and you don't necessarily know who they are, what their backgrounds are, but you can feel you're part of something. And you're walking in the footsteps of hundreds of years. You're walking exactly the same way as people were doing in the 14th century. And there's a kind of wisdom and beauty to that. So I suppose when I think of the pilgrim, the two things that strike me are there's a kind of purity of it in intention and a willingness to give yourself up. And by giving yourself up, to be filled with something much larger than yourself. You're not traveling to consume, you're traveling almost to be consumed or to be transformed. Actually, I'm thinking as I say that, when Hiroko and I drove out to see you last year in Santa Fe for our workshop, neither of us had been to Santa Fe for 30 years. So we really enjoyed, spending time around the plaza and just being with those elemental skies. And then before we came to see you, we drove up to see Georgia O'Keeffe's place, Ghost Ranch, I think it's called, in Abiquiu. So we love doing all the kind of tourist things around Santa Fe. But we also went and stayed at the Christ in the Desert Monastery in Abiquiu. And there's nothing much to see or do there. And you drive for 13 miles across an unpaved road above a 4-story drop in places. And at the end, just a little cluster of huts and a desert silence and a beautiful church. But I suppose we went there as pilgrims. And by going there as pilgrims, we knew that we would emerge from even 2 days there closer to our better selves, or at least closer to our deeper selves. And so what we did in the town of Santa Fe was wonderful and stimulating, but what we experienced in the middle of that desert was much deeper and stays with me now almost a year later. And so I suppose that's another example of the difference between a pilgrim and a mere voyager.
Yes, interesting. We've had, over the course of 7.5 years, so many people come to visit us in Baja and Santa Fe. And one of the words sometimes people use is, I'm making my pilgrimage to MEA. So that was very helpful for me to understand your point of view on that. Thank you. We have 2 more questions and then we're going to open up. But did you want to say something else, Pico?
Well, I so enjoy talking to you. Every time you say something, I'm inclined to just sort of butt in again. But when you were just saying about MEA, what I didn't realize until I came and joined you was that so much of it has to do with community, that all of us are thinking much of the time about our individual destinies and how to navigate the excitement and possibility of the second half of life. But suddenly to get to share it and suddenly to make friends with people you've never met before and feel like they're some of your best friends in the world. So it did feel like a pilgrimage to us, and that's why we're returning this August. But it did feel very much a pilgrimage into a much larger self and very much into community. We have so much time. Yeah, my wife and I have so much time on our own that the beauty of coming to MEA is dissolving into some much bigger own.
Beautiful. So one of the things that draws people to your work is the idea of finding amidst chaos some kind of peace. And tell us about a time in your own life when when what felt like a complete disruption ended up becoming one of your greatest sources of wisdom. And I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, but let's see.
You do know what I'm going to say. And it's another one of the questions I would love to ask you, because I know you've written a lot about this and talked a lot about this. So I'll give you the one that you're expecting me to say, but then I'll give you maybe a few others. So as you know, because you've heard me talk about it, I did lose everything in the world in a wildfire many, many years ago. And all these years later, it doesn't seem to me only to have been a bad thing. And again, it opened many doors that would have been closed otherwise and made many things possible that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I think losing my home suddenly made me think, what what really is my home? Where is my deepest home? Where's my spirit's home or my heart's home? And actually, in the wake of that fire, I, to some extent, moved across the ocean to the place that felt like my secret home. And I also learned I could live much less cluttered with far fewer things than I'd accumulated over my first 34 years. And I learned that as a writer, not having notes could be a blessing, because so often if I have a big pile of notes, I'm hostage to that notes. You know this as a fellow writer. And there's your outline, and there are the 50 points you want to get into the next paragraph. And again, you're dizzy. And being freed of the notes, suddenly you're writing from heart, or from your imagination, or from your memory, which are much deeper places. And again, you've heard me say this before, but years after the fire, I remembered that the very night of the fire, I had written a piece for Time magazine because I just had a front seat view on the worst fire in Californian history at that time. And I ended that piece, to go back to Japan, with a little haiku from the 17th century, not often heard then, but now I hear it much more often, in which the poet just said, "My house burnt down. I
Yeah.
can now see better the rising moon."
Yeah.
And years later, I thought something in me, it's much wiser than I am, saw the very night I lost everything that not everything in the world was lost, and that it was too soon to think in terms of loss or gain. And that, as I said, maybe in time, actually, it would make things possible. And I've been thinking recently how life is never as bad as we fear or as good as we expect, but it's certainly always very hard to see what is a good happening and a bad happening. So that's what you knew I would say. But I've been thinking about how again and again in the course of my life, whenever I've thrown myself into the unknown, or the unknown has suddenly come to me, good things have happened. I remember I was in grad school for 4 years. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be a professor. I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to do that. And finally, after 4 years, I gathered up the courage, and I went to my professors and I said, I'm going to drop out. There's nothing awaiting me. I'm just going to be jumping into a black hole, but I've got to put it to the test. I'm in my 20s. I don't have dependents. I've got to try this hard now. And so I, I, I burnt all my bridges, and I decided just to commit myself to fate. And out of nowhere, 2 weeks later, somebody came around and going from campus to campus to find somebody to hire for Time magazine. And suddenly I got this wonderful job. Pure chance in some ways, but I think once I found the courage to follow my heart, suddenly beautiful circumstances arrived. And then when I got to Time magazine, I told myself I'm only going to stay here for 4 years, and then I'm going to choose to disrupt myself, because I don't want to get caught in something and suddenly wake up and I'm 70 and I've never explored any other options. So after 4 years at this most wonderful job, I threw over my dream job and went to live in a temple in Japan, not knowing what it would bring, but feeling that just going every trip to the grocery store would be an adventure, and that the perspective from a temple in Japan would complement what I'd experienced in Midtown Manhattan. And again, when I left my job then and said, I'm just going to go and live in a temple, my editors very graciously said, would you mind if we send you a small salary every month while you're in the temple? Because the perspective from a temple in Kyoto is going to be different from the ones we're getting from Wall Street and Washington, D.C. So even that plunge, suddenly a kind of safety net arrived, and it didn't become such a plunge. I remember a few years after that, I have two stepkids, and they were entering college the same year. And surviving as a writer these days is really, really difficult. And it gets more difficult with each passing year because books and magazines are not exactly flourishing. And the very year that both my kids were going into college and I was having to pay for that, the monthly salary from Time gave out. So suddenly I have no source of income, literally zero guaranteed income, and I'm sending two kids through college. And it's a kind of thing we all have often in life, where when you think about it, it sounds really scary. And if you were to think about it, you'd get really demoralized. But actually, the way life plays out, we rode through that. There were no great stumbles. And I think, again, probably it has to do with just understanding that no event is a calamity. If you start thinking it's a calamity, then it probably will become one. But, I was really challenged when suddenly I thought my guaranteed income is zero now, and I have to pay for 4 years of college for two kids. But we all came through it wonderfully, and 25 years later, we can hardly remember it. But everyone here will have many examples of the same thing, and everyone here has survived all the many things that we've been through. So I think that's a real cause for hope.
Pico, your accent and your just way of looking at life, I think all of us could just listen to you for hours. I only have one more question, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience, from our MEA community. So MEA community, you know, I've said it before, raise your hand early, even if you don't know what you're going to ask, because there will only be so many questions that are able to be asked. You and I will be teaching a workshop in a couple months. Finding your center, building resilience to withstand any storm in Santa Fe. What's your wisdom about those who are able to withstand the storm? And again, we have quite a socio-political storm in the United States and frankly all over the world right now. Versus those who have a challenge finding their center. Who gets swept away versus who is able to withstand that storm? Or my friend Ping Fu wrote a book called Bend Not Break, and she's Chinese American. And Bend Not Break really spoke to the idea of what bamboo does, or any tree does. And there's an ability to bend but not break. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on that.
No, and that's a beautiful example of, I think, the Chinese culture, again, very wise because it's been through thousands of years of adversity and knows how to work with it. I suppose the first thing that comes to my mind again is when I travel with the Dalai Lama, and again, people come to him and say, I just lost my job. My son just died. The market just crashed. And again, he looks at them always with enormous compassion, like your dream of an uncle or a godfather. And then he says, try to take a wider perspective in time and space. And he points out that if you look at your problems all the time, they're just overwhelming. There's no way of getting beyond them or outside them or through them. But see them in a much larger picture. Remember that nothing lasts. Remember that conditions are always changing. And then maybe they will seem less overwhelming. Again, think of yourself as a drop in the ocean, part of something large and pretty strong. And then the changing tides and the froth on the top of the sea is not going to be so terrifying. And so to speak to the current political moment, as you were saying, I think a part of it may be that the world is swinging like such a mad pendulum at the moment. And I think one of the important things may be not to be distracted by what happened 6 minutes ago or even 6 days ago, but to see it on a much larger canvas. I mean, I think whether it's Brazil or the Philippines or the US, one party comes to power and initiates very extreme measures, and then the rival party comes and initiates extreme measures in the opposite direction, and the first one comes, and we're just being buffeted back and forth. But underneath those changing tides, I think the world is moving in one direction. It's a very positive direction. In the course of my life, individuals are living much more globally and much less defined by black and white divisions. And technology is allowing me to talk to you and from across the world and see you and talk to all our friends. I couldn't have imagined that 20 years ago. And I think rights for people like myself who don't look like a typical all-American boy have really improved beyond anything I could have imagined in the course of my lifetime. So I think it's worthwhile not being, again, it's like not following the news, not being attentive to what just happened, or to assume that what just happened is more important than what is steadily happening. And one thing I've learned very valuably from my monk friends, whether Buddhist or Catholic, people like Richard Rohr and the Dalai Lama, is that joy is different from happiness. Happiness is what we feel when we're on a golden beach and it's a beautiful sunny day and no one else is there and we have not a care on the world. Joy is what you feel when the world is difficult, but you still have this absolute confidence. And actually, the Dalai Lama is a very good example of that, because I sometimes think nobody I know in life has suffered more than he has. That's why we were saying he's had to live 66 years away from his people and the place he was meant to rule. He's seen 13 of his 15 siblings die. He's referred to as a devil in monk's robes by the government of one of the largest nations of earth. And yet all we associate with him is this constant smile and his infectious laugh and his robust confidence. So he has chosen and worked to ground himself in something much deeper than the passing moment. And for all the afflictions every day brings him, he's rooted in something far beyond that. And again, you and I have, among many things in common, the wonderful Benedictine monks in Big Sur, California, near Esalen, who are at New Camaldoli. And I've, as you know, I've been on retreat with them more than 100 times. And they're exactly the same. And one reason I mention them, because it speaks to your earlier question about different cultures and stress. You know, I was talking about how wise Japan is, but there's plenty of wisdom around us in California and New Mexico and the US. And again, I remember during the pandemic when all of us were so rattled, one of my monk friends, American in Big Sur, just sent around a message and he said, remember, the best cure for anxiety is taking care of others. This is such a simple thing, but when we're rattled, we tend to forget that, and we're so preoccupied, you know, what's going to happen to me and my bank account and my future and everything now that the world's in lockdown. And he just said, take care of others. Look around the people around you and how you can help them. And then you're going to be freed from your concerns, and you're actually going to be doing something constructive. And you'll be in the world not of your thoughts, which are like a beehive, but in the world of action, which is always, nearly always going to be a better place to be. And I'll end so that we have more time for questions from our friends, just by saying that because, as you know so well, the monks that I know in Big Sur live on 900 acres of remote wilderness. They're always being encircled by fire, and they're constantly having to run for their lives. And just a few years ago, a terrible fire broke out on the property right next to theirs. And so nearly all the monks fled, but 3 of them stayed behind to help the firefighters. And one of them was the prior. And so every now and then he would send out updates to concerned friends like myself. And one morning he said, all we can see around us is smoke. And there are these flashing, pulsing lights through the fog that we can see. And there's this roar of fire and flame just behind the ridge, 200 yards away from us. But don't worry, we're maintaining our offices. We're still practicing vigils and vespers and matins. We're meeting 3 times a day and praying and singing the psalms in our chapter room. Blessed day all. He said, blessed day all, on the day when it looked as if he might well lose his life and lose everything that he cared about and loved. And of course, that partly, that kind of confidence comes from faith. But even if we don't have that kind of faith, I think there's a certain trust in the universe that's available to anyone, whatever your religious dispensation or lack of it. And just to sense that the universe often has better plans for us than we have for the universe. And you know, I think confidence is something that we can cultivate like a muscle, and that is available to most of us if we can just find the right place in ourselves to listen to the right truth. So it's a long answer, but I'm so looking forward to getting your answers to all these questions when we meet in August.
Yes. I just want to quote J.D. Salinger when you talked about happiness and joy. He said that happiness is a solid and joy is a liquid. And I get that. Happiness is circumstantial often, and it's tangible, whereas joy is coming from within. And it is, you overflow with joy. And so in many ways, joy is what we should be really investing in, or just learning how to find joy in any kind of experience. So we have a few questions. Yes, Betsy, this is where we ask questions. There are a few questions that came up, and I'm going to go to the first one came from Keith Lawrence. And so Keith, well, and I'm not seeing any signs of hands here. So I don't know if Betsy, it's good you've moved up to the first. Carol, you didn't want to ask a question, did you? No. Okay. Oh, there we go. Mia has, okay, got it. So it is working. So Keith Lawrence asks, what are practical tips in maintaining joy when someone cuts you off in traffic or something really bad happens to you?
Well, I think the cutting off in traffic, I'm going to be as agitated as anybody in the world. You know, I'll be cursing, and I spend much of my time cursing my printer here in our little apartment when it's not working. And my wife always says, talk nicely to the printer and it'll behave better. And she's usually right. I think there's no cure for cursing in traffic, and there's no cure for the horror and discomfort of being stuck in rush hour traffic, and I know it more and more. But I think the challenge is to try to make your mind as much as possible like a large open meadow, and as little as possible like rush hour, the freeway in the middle of rush hour traffic. And that's a gradual process, as I was saying, that probably comes cumulatively over months and years of just practices, whether it's meditation or yoga or taking a walk, that slowly open up a space within you so that when a difficult thing happens, you have those inner resources. I call it the inner savings account. And that's the only thing we have to draw on when life suddenly throws us a curveball, because our bank account isn't much help and our resume is no good, and all the achievements we've done in the world kind of beside the point. The only thing we have to turn to are our inner resources. So the question is, how can we build those inner resources? Each person has a different way. Some of the people play tennis, some people play the violin, some people consult a spiritual teacher. But make sure you're spending at least as much time on your inner resources as your external. And even in the simplest way, for example, I spend an hour every day going to the health club, walking to the health club and doing 30 minutes of cardiovascular exercise. And sometimes I think to myself, if I spend a whole hour every day working on my body, I could surely spend at least that much time working on my heart and my spirit, because they're much more important to our welfare. So I don't have a quick answer to those questions, but I do think they're determined by how we choose to spend our time. And every now and then I'll hear myself say, I don't have time to spend an hour just sitting quietly or taking a walk. I've got too many things to do. And if I hear myself say that, I know that's exactly the time I have to do nothing or have to sit still. Because to me, if I say I don't have time to do nothing, it's like saying I don't have time to take my medicine, or I don't have time to go to the doctor, or I don't have time to be healthy, which is really the same as I don't have time to be joyful.
Yes.
So it's not a direct answer to your question, but I think each of us has our own inner practices that will help navigate not necessarily the traffic, but the other difficulties in life.
Beautiful. Thank you. Mia, let's unmute you and let you ask a brief question.
You bet. Well, thank you both again for being here. My question is, I'm trying my best to be available to my partner and my loved ones. And I meditate, I spend time out in nature. And yet, my most significant partner struggles with wanting to do any of those things. So, that balance between being in service and wanting to radiate calm and support. But when you have loved ones that struggle with life but don't want to try any of the things, how to not be a nag but how to influence positively.
All right. Thank you, Mia. Any suggestions, Pico?
Thank you, Mia. I found in my life it's really, really hard to change anyone else, but it's always possible to change myself. And so I think I want to concentrate on the things I can change. My guess is your partner will find his or her own way of navigating life, which will be very different from yours. I have friends who actually get exhilarated by being in the middle of crowds and racing around a bit, and that's where maybe their health lies. So I would just concentrate on making sure you can sustain what works for you, and assume that his or her well-being will take care of itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Mia. Let's go to Eileen. Let's go ahead and Mia, go ahead. Yeah, there you go.
Here I am. Thank you so much. I meditate. I run 5 miles a day, and almost every hour now, there is something that pops up that is the most cruel response from, I live in California, from our government that is going after people that now have said to the VA doctors, you don't have to take care of Republicans or people who are, I mean, the cruelty goes on. And it is hard not to become angry and respond to that. And I will do what I can, and I'm here to say whatever I can do for my country, but I don't know how to make it through the meanness and the cruelty that I see that's coming from this nation.
Beautiful. Eileen, thank you. Pico.
It's the same question we're all facing, and I would just say, bring as much kindness to everyone around you as you can. I think you know already that the government is mean, and none of these developments are changing that. They're just reinforcing what you know already. And honestly, again, I feel for myself, the less time I spend thinking about a government I can't do anything about, and the more time I spend about thinking about what I can to about my wife right here and my neighbors across the street, the better off I am, because it's not as if any of this is news. It's just telling you what you know already, which is this extremely unkind government. To me, 10 years ago, we had an extremely enlightened and fair-minded government. And this current government is not going to stay around forever. But I think there's very little you can do to change what's happening in Washington. And there's a lot you can do probably to help what's going on in California around you. So I'm not sure if that's a useful answer, but that's what I try to follow.
I've been working on a new blog post for, I think, next Tuesday, called "Moral Beauty Knows No Political Party." And I'm everybody knows here I'm pretty dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. But I've really been trying to seek solace in talking to people from the other side of the aisle and have a thoughtful conversation. Nikhil, let's go to you.
Yeah, thank you both. Wonderful conversation. Pico, I read your story about the wildfire, and I followed your talks with the Dalai Lama. Quick question on your yoga practice. Yoga is something that I'm starting to get into, and I've heard you mention it a few times. If you don't mind sharing.
I'm really embarrassed on all these fronts. I only practice yoga vicariously, by which I mean my wife does it, and she learned it in India, my Japanese wife. I've never practiced yoga. I don't
Oh, really?
meditate. I don't have any such practice. My equivalent practice is every morning I go to my desk and sit there for 5 hours, and that's my job, but it's also my equivalent to my meditation practice. But I'm afraid I don't know anything
No,
very much about yoga.
All right.
You know more about it than I do.
How about you, Chip?
I think a lot of people here know that Chip has I have a great relationship with meditation, a fraught relationship with yoga. What I had to learn is that I need to stop comparing. When I stopped comparing, I started enjoying yoga, and that helped. So,
right. But then Indian yoga is not so much the contorting your body and all. It's more the Yoga Sutras, the how to live, a handbook for life, in terms of.
I don't know if you can see this, but I was in India 5 months ago, and got these beautiful yoga statues.
Oh yeah.
India is fascinating in terms of. But okay, let's move on. Thank you, Nikhil. Appreciate it. Jill, let's go to you.
Hello, Chip and Pico. So good to see you. Pico, you shared some of the wisdom that we can learn from older cultures. And I read last week that in Japan, in the Japanese culture, there's this shared concept of having enough. So my first question, is that true? Because it's, of course, anathema to our striving culture in the US, and that feels like such a fundamental source of our stress and a cause of needing to be resilient. So is it true, and is there some perspective you can lend to us on that?
Yes. So if you go to Kyoto, and again, Chip will know this well, there's a famous rock garden with 15 rocks in it in Ryoanji, and from no place can you see all 15 rocks. So it's a famous meditative koan that's lived there for 300 years. But just around the corner from that garden is a little wash basin, and there's one Chinese character on each of its 4 sides, and in the middle there's a hole. And if you put those 5 characters together, it says, "What I have is all I need." Exactly what you were saying, that the nature of luxury is not a function of how much you have, but how much you don't need. And as long as you can meet your needs, that's one's definition of contentment and happiness and probably joy. And I know in my own experience, I moved from an apartment on Park Avenue with a bottomless expense account and all the splendors the world could offer, to a single room in the back streets of Kyoto, no toilet of my own, no telephone, no bed. And I quickly realized that that empty room made me much richer than my exciting life in New York City. Because while I was in New York City, I was always sort of speeding up and what can I do next? And how can I get, as Chip was saying, how can I get above my colleagues? How can I climb the next hurdle? And as soon as I moved to this Japan, which is, as you know, a much calmer place and thinks about the collective much more, suddenly all that fell away. And I thought, all I need is, so my wife and I have lived for 32 years in this 2-room apartment, middle of nowhere, no car, no bicycle. I've never used a cell phone. Our rent is $500 a month, so it's sort of like living like students, but we have everything we want. And my wife this morning was saying, oh, now we're going to have to move tomorrow to this big house in California. What are we going to do? We're going to miss our small, obscure apartment. So I think all of us have probably had the experience of moving from a situation of seeming luxury to one of seeming simplicity and wondering, why does the simplicity fill us up so much more than the luxury?
Beautiful. Thank you. Betsy, I'm afraid Jane, this is gonna be our last one. I do love you, Jane. Betsy, your last question, brief, make it brief if you can.
Okay. Okay. It's similar to the woman, I'm sorry, I forgot her name a few minutes ago, about the harshness and the cruelty. I've been an environmental activist through media, trying to educate the public for almost 30 years. I'm now a grandmother. I had my daughter when I started this, and things have, are being deliberately rolled back right now. It's not only cruel, but it's idiocy, and there is urgency. And people like my husband who—
Betsy, what's
Yeah.
the question?
The question is, when people say there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do, and if your work happens to be educating people, because if they knew what we environmentalists know, they wouldn't vote for deniers over and over and over again. So there is a sense of urgency. How do I find calm, especially with this little granddaughter looking at me? And so that yin and yang is just getting more extreme all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy.
My guess is your granddaughter is giving you much more joy than the government. And that's where I would be bringing my attention. This wonderful young lady who's come into your life, who's representing hope. Of course, you're worried and want to make sure you can protect her future. But the more time you spend with her and the less you spend fretting about it, government, I think the happier you'll be. And when I was talking earlier, because I'm working in the mainstream media 43 years, about not listening to the news, it's because I've learned that the news concentrates only on what's exceptional, what's very dramatic, which tends to be harrowing and terrible news. And it's not talking about the 1,000 people who are doing acts of kindness. If 3,000 cars are driving along a freeway and one has an accident, the news will be just about the one that's misbehaved and not about the 2,999 who are doing very well. So I think the news gives us a very distorted and in some ways hysterical image of the world, and is also trying to work us up into a state of emotion and anxiety. And the world is proceeding in a much saner way. So I would look to your granddaughter as your teacher.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you. I know how important that is to you, based upon our conversations last year. And maybe I may see you in August if my memory serves me correct. Pico, thank you. I love you so much. I mentioned moral beauty knows no political party, but moral beauty knows a human like you. And moral beauty is as Dacher Keltner, one of our faculty members, has told us, the number one pathway to feeling awe. And to be able to witness awe in someone who is just a fellow human gives me a sense of elevation of what I can do. So I just want to say thank you. I'm so excited to see you in August. I hope some of you are going to sign up. I mean, we have a lot of people already signed up, by the way. But this is going to be a small to mid-sized workshop. So for those of you who don't want really, really, really big workshops, this will be a nice sized workshop with intimate time with me and Pico. Last year's group loved it. So thank you so much to everybody for being here. Pico, go. I know you're not going to go back to sleep, but you deserve to.
Thank you, Chip. I was just going to say, I think of you as an embodiment of joy and light, even in the midst of often very difficult circumstances. So thank you. And both of us are counting the days till we see you in mid-August.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
And they shake their heads and they tell me that I've changed. Well, something's lost.
See you, friend.